Traditionally, roguelikes are rooted in turn-based games, and while this genre has recently been shadowed quite a bit by the action tag, there are still many out there. But these days, when considering turn-based roguelikes, the traditional approach might not be what first comes to mind to most people. Instead, in the last few years, a different kind of turn-based design started seeing a rise in popularity: deck-building roguelikes. Deck-building roguelikes are a unique genre that grew from modern roguelikes and roguelites. Designing a deck-building game comes with many unique concepts and challenges that may not be present in other roguelikes. I, myself, love these games, and after having played countless hours of over 30 different deck-building roguelikes, I've decided to talk about what I think makes a good deck-building roguelike. The Binding of Isaac, Enter the Gungeon, Spelunky. Each of these games are considered classics in the rogue community and have inspired many developers to create unique games based on them. It is inevitable that when comparing new games and previously successful games of the same genre, similarities will appear. For example, the classic Rogue Legacy and a random newer roguelite such as Dungreed are very similar in many respects, both being 2D action platformers with simple gameplay. But although they share very similar concepts, they both feel different to play and control thanks to their real-time gameplay as well as different physics. Within seconds of starting a new action roguelike, common mechanics such as jumping, attacking, dashing, or even moving will generally feel unique from one game to the next, even if just slightly. The same can generally also apply to level and enemy design. But all of this is a different story when talking about deck-building roguelikes. As opposed to the action tag, this genre is much more specific and usually takes inspiration from just a single source: Slay the Spire. Now, contrary to popular belief, Slay the Spire wasn't the first of its kind. That honor goes to DreamQuest, a mobile game released in 2014, which later on inspired the development of Slay the Spire in 2017, being the first real successful deck-building roguelike. And this led to many more great games we see today, such as Monster Train, Roguebook, Across the Obelisk. And while most of these games are very similar to Slay the Spire, they each have their own twists and mechanics within the constraints of the genre. Roguebook has players control 2 characters at once, with a focus on character positioning. Monster Train has players managing 3 separate boards at the same time while resolving turns in an auto-battler manner. Across the Obelisk has players control 4 characters, each with their separate turns, resulting in overall longer and more strategic fights. Yet, when looking at many of these games, it's not uncommon to encounter similar or identical cards between games, especially when looking at the start of a new run. Low-cost cards that block or heal a small amount of damage, low-cost cards that will deal a small amount of damage. Not only are many cards similar to one another across games, but their effect may ultimately feel the same because of the lack of physics and real-time gameplay. Deck-building gameplay is text-related, meaning that visuals are not necessary and games could ultimately be played blindfolded if given the necessary information. The reason I am bringing this up is because I find it crucial to recognize deck-building games as a much more restricted genre in terms of having original gameplay when compared to action roguelikes. With the lack of real-time gameplay and more niche design, it's much more common to find deck-building games to be very similar from one another, especially when they don't have a unique twist through their gameplay. As such, having some sort of unique mechanic is much more important within this genre. This is also why Slay the Spire happens to be one of the simplest deck-building roguelikes out there. Having been one of the first of its kind, it didn't need to rely on a unique mechanic in order to stand out. A deck-building game that has no unique mechanic but just a huge variety of cards or passive effects would simply be a Slay the Spire clone, no matter how different the story, the visuals, or the audio is. Having a different gimmick will not only help a game stand out, but will also allow cards to be designed around these mechanics, creating novel gameplay within this more restricted genre. When I play a new deck-building game, my first question is, what is the gimmick? The game Arcanium has a collectible card called Cleave, which deals a small amount of damage to multiple enemies at the cost of 1 energy. It is practically identical to the card Cleave in Slay the Spire, which also cost 1 energy to deal a small amount of damage to multiple enemies. But the game's gimmick of playing 3 characters at once with an added focus on board positioning makes these cards feel different from one another. On the other hand, when I first played the game Deck of Ashes, I didn't find its mechanic of expanding health to bring back played cards from the discard pile impactful or interesting enough. Even though it had RPG elements, different characters, and substantial exploration, I felt the gameplay was too similar to Slay the Spire, making it a dull experience for me. Now, that being said, this doesn't mean that every deck-building roguelike out there will always have many aspects of their design and gameplay be similar to Slay the Spire. It's important to recognize how new this genre is, only being a few years old. And with how quickly the video game world is expanding every year, we are seeing more and more unique design approaches to deck-building roguelikes, such as Balatro, a poker-inspired deck-building roguelike, or even Peglin, a Peggle-like deck-building roguelike. Deck-building games may have strong similarities from one another due to the inherent nature of turn-based design and the fact that independent games are much more restricted compared to big-budgeted games. It's important to have some sort of unique mechanic or gimmick since they cannot rely on just having fluid gameplay or satisfying combat visuals, something that many action games can get away with much easily. Deck-building roguelikes will usually be divided into two sections, the core combat and the out-of-combat gameplay. In most cases, over 80% of the content will generally lie within the combat, but this doesn't mean the other 20% isn't important. Out-of-combat areas are used as a way to link one encounter to another, as well as adding other quick events and decision points, generally used to upgrade the player's deck. They also serve as a breather between fights. For instance, after a fight in Wildfrost, players may have a choice to either go to a Muncher to delete 2 cards from their deck permanently, making draws more consistent, or choose to go to the Frozen Travelers for a choice of one of 3 new companions to add to their deck before their next fight. Either choice is viable, and may be more impactful depending on the player's current build. Having shops to purchase cards, items, or upgrades using money earned from battles is another common example, allowing players to easily add or modify their deck without risk, a welcoming feature in a generally challenging genre. But special events are what I find most interesting. Most of these games will generally have some variation of random events players can choose to encounter. These will usually introduce some sort of risk versus reward decision point and tend to be unique to the game, adding to the overall immersion. They are usually accompanied by text and will reward the player with some sort of interesting outcome. I always find these to be very entertaining, as they can be very impactful with just a simple click of a button, especially for ones that are unknown until encountered, preventing players from knowing whether they are worth engaging with or not, adding to the risk versus reward element, a design choice I personally love. For instance, in Monster Train, players may come across the Malika Mutator event, which offers up to 3 negative passive items to collect. Players are free to take as many as they wish, knowing that each of them are terrible items that can only add negative effects to the current run. But if the player is able to survive 2 battles while holding them, they will then be able to trade these cumbersome artifacts for powerful ones instead, rewarding players for taking the risk. The fact that this event gives the player a choice of taking 1, 2, 3, or no items, and will change the outcome of the run with any of these choices with just a click of a button, is great design. Whether events are to be unknown until encountered or not, any kind of event is always exciting and serve as a way to keep players engaged with simple but interesting decisions across a run. Unsurprisingly, card design is one of the most important components in deck-building games. Even if many may look unoriginal or have glaring similarities with cards in other games, they still require a lot of thought in order to design fun and interesting gameplay. Most games will divide their cards into categories, depending on the game's mechanics. Slay the Spire has power, skill, and attack cards. Monster Train has minions and spell cards. Categorizing cards can also help keep a player's deck organized instead of being full of a large number of random cards. In many cases, cards also come with different degrees of rarity. This usually helps keep a sense of progression through runs instead of having every card easily obtainable from the start. Rarer cards will usually be stronger than common cards, but will also tend to be more situational. This allows cards of all rarity to have a chance of being impactful instead of simply having the stronger, rarer cards always carry an entire run. For instance, Slay the Spire's Grand Finale is a rare card that deals 50 damage to all enemies, which is particularly strong, but can only be played if there are no cards in your draw pile. This effect could easily wipe out most enemies, but its condition is specific enough for it to not be overpowered. Having an effect such as this would generally be ill-advised as a common card, as their purpose is to be simple and easily synergetic. In many cases, decks will consist of many common cards that have simple effects but will synergize well with rarer cards or passive effects granted by upgrades or items. Sword Boomerang in Slay the Spire, which reads deal 3 damage to a random enemy 3 times, is a great example when talking about good card design. Spending 1 energy to deal a total of 9 damage is a fairly weak effect, but its simple design allows it to synergize very well with other effects. For example, the player can increase their character's strength, adding +1 damage to attacks. This will have a significant impact on Sword Boomerang's multi-hit attack, benefiting 3 times from the strength bonus. A rare card such as Bludgeoning, which deals 32 damage but costs 3 energy, may look flashier and more impressive to new players, but doesn't tend to synergize very well with many other effects, making it potentially worse than a common card like Sword Boomerang. Even for games such as Astria that have rare cards, or in this instance dice, be much stronger than commons in most situations, common cards always have an important role in a game's early game, helping players to get further in a run while only being able to utilize these generally less impactful cards before being able to find more powerful rarer cards in the late game. For instance, in Balatro, most common jokers, which are the in-game passive effects, are fairly weak. Gluttonous Joker, a common joker which adds +4 multiplier for each club played, compared to Onyx Agate, which adds +8 multiplier for each club played, is strictly just a weaker joker in comparison. But the fact that Gluttonous Joker is encountered much more frequently in the early game and is cheaper to purchase may still present this joker as an impactful card in many early game situations, since it's more likely to help players out of the first few encounters before being able to encounter and purchase these stronger, rarer jokers in the mid to late game that will eventually win the run. Wild Frost, an auto-battler deck-building roguelike, is one of the only games I've came across that doesn't have any sort of rarity between cards or collectible items. And while I really enjoy the game, I believe one of its biggest flaws is the lack of consistency in being able to create synergies due to the lack of rarities. Runs may end up being a bit too inconsistent and random in power level, with every card having an equal chance of being offered at all times, making it more challenging when trying to go for specific builds, and sometimes frustrating since there is no way of controlling what kind of cards you may be offered at any time. Having simple but synergetic common cards while also having a few powerful but more situational cards is generally a good way to balance cards and keep players engaged with interesting and unique paths to different builds. But so far, most of these points are centered around the concept of balance and design, even though, negotiably, the most important aspect is whether a card is fun. No matter how well designed or balanced cards are, they need to be fun in order to have positive experiences every run. I believe one of the best compliments a deck building game can receive is how satisfying it is to play. The most enjoyable moments I've ever encountered or while watching others play these games is when card combinations and synergies work hand to hand and allow satisfying outcomes. Now, of course, all of this is linked to how cards are designed, but the best designed game doesn't always mean that it is the most satisfying as well. It's important to have cards be synergetic with each other while allowing players to create their own combos that are satisfying to combine and experience. At the time of recording this, Balatro has gotten a huge amount of success in a very small amount of time, and even though I find the overall balance of the game quite uneven, what the game does better than most is giving players constant opportunities to combine certain cards and jokers in order to create huge chain events and end up with ridiculously large points, making it one of the most satisfying experiences I've had in a while. Not to mention that overall, the game is one of the easiest to understand and to start with, when compared to most other deck-building roguelikes, which are usually filled with rules, keywords, and mechanics players need to learn before being able to truly enjoy the game as a whole. It can be fairly intimidating for a player to start a new deck-building game, especially if they're not very familiar with the genre. Balatro is simple and easy to understand even for players that are not aware of basic poker rules, making the game much more appealing and approachable while also making it easier for anyone to have fun. Because at the end of the day, beating an encounter with ease, thanks to a combination of cards and items collected and chosen by the player, is one of the best feelings playing these games. Looking at another card in Slay the Spire, such as Foreign Influence, a Watcher card which lets the player choose a card from another class, this card might not be very powerful, especially in non-upgraded, but the ability to find cards that are normally unobtainable playing as the Watcher can lead to many fun and unique situations, not to mention having a chance to potentially synergize with whichever build the player is currently running. Even if it generally isn't a particularly viable strategy, I'm always excited to add one to my deck because of the random potential of the card. On the other hand, Judgment, a rare Watcher card that instantly kills any enemy at or under 30 hit points, doesn't really synergize with anything and will usually end up being of the same power level in any build or situation, making it fairly boring, even if potentially powerful. In fact, the concept behind controlled randomness, such as being able to pick from 3 different random cards, tends to be a very enjoyable feeling. This is one of the many reasons why Hearthstone was such a popular card game for so many years. While not a roguelike, Hearthstone's overall design heavily revolves around RNG, or overall random effects, something that most non-digital card games cannot utilize as much. And one of the most beloved mechanics in Hearthstone is the Discover effect, which allows players to choose from a selection of 3 random cards. This controlled randomness effect allows players to be strategic with which selection to pick out of the random choices and potentially win by utilizing randomness as well as strategy, making games fairly consistent while still having every match be unique thanks to the nature of discovering different options every time. And while this exact case might not be present in many games, controlled randomness is present in more instances than most would think. Looking back at Astria, the entire game revolves around controlled randomness. Each turn, players are rolling multiple dice, each with 6 possible outcomes. And while every face might have drastically different effects, making every roll very random, the game is designed around this randomness so that every die face can usually be utilized in some way, even ones that may look weak or even harmful. Whatever the outcome of the dice rolls, players should always be able to find ways to use any dice face and strategize around the random nature of the game. But even outside of specific designs, common effects we see in many games may have some variation of controlled randomness, such as cards that read deal a certain amount of damage to multiple random enemies, just like Sword Boomerang. Instead of just using these on a random amount of enemies, it's generally best to utilize these kinds of effects more strategically by maybe reducing the amount of enemies or reducing certain enemies' hit points to a certain amount that would guarantee or increase the odds of splitting the random damage more favorably. A card such as Excavation Eruption in Monster Train not only uses this design, but even rewards players for using it correctly, with its effect of gaining extra energy if the card kills an enemy. So while its effect might indeed be random, strategically reducing enemy hit points to increase the probability of them being slain by the effect is a form of controlled randomness, which is very satisfying. Because the entire point of controlled randomness is the satisfaction of feeling as if players outsmarted a game by controlling aspects that may at first seem out of their control. The idea that a card that says random can actually be manipulated in a way that will usually always be more beneficial is a great feeling. This kind of design isn't a necessity to have in every game, but shows a good example of a fun design concept upon many that I personally find very entertaining. Overall, cards that have the potential to synergize with multiple different scenarios, as well as cards that may create some sort of unique effect, are more likely to be exciting and, of course, fun. When you hear the word deck building, odds are cards will unsurprisingly come to mind. But cards don't necessarily need to be involved when talking about deck building games. Most examples featured so far may have had cards be the focal point, but there are now many ways to bypass this restriction, so to say. Because when looking at the core design of these games, the deck building genre is actually referring to the gameplay as opposed to strictly needing to feature cards. Today, if someone were to look up the Deckbuilding Roguelike tag on Steam, they may be presented with more and more games that do not feature any cards at all. The concept behind deck building games is to have players collect items, units, or abilities throughout a run and be used to fight enemies, usually in a turn-based manner. These collectibles may be in the form of cards, but ultimately, it doesn't really matter. A game such as Astria uses dice instead of cards. Peglin uses orbs. Backpack Hero simply uses random items and weapons that are instead added to a backpack, creating this unique turn-based deck building experience. This sort of freedom gives developers more liberties and ultimately allow games to focus more on other aspects such as themes, aesthetics, and visuals. Visuals are always an important aspect when it comes to developing a game. But one key differentiation with a deck-building roguelike is the overall pacing and the fact that players are much more likely to be spending more time on a static screen. With the inherent complexity of turn-based roguelikes, it is expected to end up spending turns and turns on a single screen against a single encounter. Therefore, while maybe not always a priority, I do find it important for these games to have visuals that accommodate a game's overall theme and mood. Peglin, while quite minimalistic in its visuals, has very clear distinctions between each floor during a combat, as well as out of combat, giving this sense of adventure and immersion. On the other hand, I do enjoy the art in Astria, but each new biome is color-coded so similarly to one another that it doesn't make me feel as if I'm progressing from one area to another, making the overall experience feel less of an adventure. All of these points do obviously apply to many other genres than just deck-building roguelikes, but I find it important to distinguish when talking about these slow-paced games. I don't expect a deck-building game to have as outstanding visuals as a game with a bigger focus on exploration, such as a Metroidvania, but I do find it important for these games to be somewhat immersive so that when players are eventually going to be spending multiple minutes staring at the same screen, it doesn't just feel like staring at numbers. One of my favorite deck-building games in the last few years has been Roguebook, and while I do have some issues with it as a whole, the overall theme and world this game portraits is so immersive that I always want to come back to it just for another run, knowing that the beautiful visuals, music, and animation will keep me immersed while I eventually end up pondering over complicated turns. And while a game such as Slay the Spire might not have anything revolutionary visually, its overall ambience and mood is very fitting, creating its own unique feeling while playing the game. And that's about everything. If you want to see more videos about roguelike design, feel free to let me know by giving the video a like and subscribing for more content. I also stream on YouTube fairly regularly, playing many different roguelikes, talking about their design while enjoying some fun gameplay. Feel free to come by and say hi. Thanks for watching.